Hello everyone, it's GigaBeef here, and today we're going to be talking about suppressors in Tarkov and specifically suppressor combinations in EFT, because that's really where the confusion often lies with people when they're trying to understand what the best things to use on their weapons is. So clearly when we're playing Tarkov, having a suppressor is actually pretty good, especially if you're solo, because it means that you can hide your location a little bit more than if you're running a loud build, and especially if you're playing against a squad, then people don't necessarily know exactly where you are, and it makes it easier to relocate and harder for people to spot where you are. That's all well and good, but one of the major advantages of suppressors in the game, and the reason why a lot of people do use them irrespective of this fact, is because they reduce your recoil overall when used in combination with a lot of the muzzle brakes. This is especially the case for a lot of Western guns like the 5.56 and 7.62 NATO weapons, but there is a handful of other guns that also can benefit from this too, which we'll go into in a second. When you add a suppressor on top of a muzzle brake, you do get the recoil benefits of both, which is pretty amazing and is usually where some of the best meta builds come from. However, you do have to balance that out with the rest of the weapons build because of the ergonomics of the suppressor, which is normally quite negative. The problem comes for players trying to decide which one's the best, because it's not really that obvious when you're in the weapons building setup and you have to go through each separate combination separately. So you have to add the brake and then the suppressor and then change over the brake and the suppressor. Whereas normally if you're comparing muzzles for an easier weapon, you can just mouse over the different options and see which one is best. Whereas it's not the case for these combinations, which makes it more problematic to try and figure out actually which one is the best one. So as I said, we're not going to go through every suppressor in the game because there are a lot of them and some of them are much easier to compare than these. So we're going to focus on the 5.56 suppressors and the 7.62 NATO suppressors. So I'm going to link to a chart in the description as well, one that I'll be referencing so we can decide which one's the best. Just a point before we start, that there are a lot of stats on these things. There's loudness, where people are unsure exactly what this does. You have the accuracy bonus, recoil, ergonomics, muzzle velocity, durability burn, and heat. Today, again, we're going to be focusing on recoil and we're going to be focusing on ergonomics because the muzzle velocity is nice and some of the durability, burn, and heat statistics are interesting, but they don't make enough difference in general gameplay. And so I really think that you should be making your decision mostly around recoil and ergo, unless you're going for something very, very specific. I've got these suppressors listed from best to worst in terms of recoil, and so we're going to start off for 5.56 with the Silencer Co combination. Now this is the best that you can get overall in terms of recoil control, and it gives you minus 23% recoil between the two, which is pretty amazing at the expense of 24 ergonomics. The downside here is that you need Peacekeeper 4 for the suppressor, but you only need Peacekeeper 3 for the muzzle brake. Now, when I was putting my list together, I had dollars at 136, and that meant that this suppressor cost about 70k and was about the same price on the flea market. Dollars have been changing quite a bit recently, so we're going to just have to see what happens with that. But you can always buy them on the flea. It does tend to be pretty expensive though, as you might imagine, for the best in slot in terms of recoil, which is usually highly prized. The next one is the AAC Blackout 51T and suppressor. This is actually very similar to the Silencer Co. This has got one less recoil on it for minus 22 total and minus 27 ergo, so it's actually 3 worse on ergonomics. It does tend to be a little bit cheaper though on the flea market, with this suppressor going for about 50k normally, and although it's exactly the same in terms of traders with Peacekeeper 3 for the muzzle brake and Peacekeeper 4 for the suppressor. Next up we have the Thunder Beast, which is kind of interesting. So this is again very slightly worse than the previous two. This gives you 21.5 recoil, so it's very similar to the AAC. It gives you minus 25 ergonomics, so it's 2 ergonomics better actually than the previous one. So that could be potentially worth it. The interesting thing to me about the Thunder Beast is that, yes, again, you get the muzzle brake at Peacekeeper 3, but the way that you get this suppressor, you can buy it on the flea market, and it is pretty expensive because it is one of the best suppressors that you can buy for 5.56. But there's an interesting barter that comes at Skier 3. So this really depends on your timing. So you can use a boss cap and then 2 leather caps, and then you can buy the suppressor using this barter. Now it really depends what they're going for at the time. You can buy boss caps down to about 10k, something like that, and then going for leather caps, if you can get them at about 15,000, then that means that you're buying the suppressor for about 40k, which is actually really amazing given the stats that it has. So that's where the Thunder Beast comes in. You want to be looking out for the barter and trying to buy those components cheap if you can, and stocking up a few because you can only buy 1 per reset. Next one, onto the RC2. Now this suppressor is actually pretty good and used to be one of my favorites. This is interesting because there are 3 suppressors and there are 3 compensators that are all compatible with each other because they're all Surefire. So the Surefire SOCOM 5.56, this fits onto the SF3P. It also fits onto this one here, the FH556RC, and then it also fits onto the War Comp as well. Now, out of these three, basically the SF3P is the best one. This you could buy at Mechanic 2, and the War Comp you can buy at Skier 2, even though the SF3P is just straight up better, and you're probably not going to be using these until you have Mechanic 2 anyway. So I'd say just scrap the War Comp. The FH you can only get on the flea market, so scrap this as well. It's functionally identical to the SF3P, and just buy these off Mechanic if you want to combine with any of the Surefire suppressors. The RC2 is kind of interesting. It only comes in tan, and you can only buy it on the flea market. It is normally quite cheap at about 27k, so I think maybe this is a bit of a hidden gem. But look out for that on the flea market. If it's under 30k, it's probably quite decent, given that it gives you recoil of -18 for an ergonomics of -18. So it's a bit less in recoil, like 3.5% versus the Thunder Beast, but it gives you actually another 7 ergo in comparison when you combine the two together. So it could potentially be something that's useful on a more budget build, or something that's a bit more balanced in terms of ergonomics. Right, the next one is the Knights Armament QDC and the NT4. This one is really popular because you find these suppressors all over the place. It's actually really easy to buy. Again, it's actually about the same price as the RC2, to be honest, and it gives something very, very similar. So in terms of recoil, it's the same with -18, but it's actually 4 worse in terms of ergonomics. So if you can buy the RC2, then I would advise doing so, but otherwise it's a completely fine suppressor to use if you have them lying around. And at Peacekeeper 2, to buy the compensator, you can buy these really cheaply on the flea. Technically, they're Peacekeeper 3 and you have to complete a quest to get the black version, but they're so much cheaper on the flea market, about half the price that on the trader, so just look for them there. Next up is the next one in the series of Surefire suppressors. So we have the Monster, and I said we're going to pair this with the SF3P. I put these here just so I could compare them together. But with the SF3P and the Monster, this comes in actually just 1 lower than the SF3P version. So this is -17 recoil but -17 ergo, so you get 1 extra ergo and you lose 1 recoil for it, so it's completely fine. Again, it's quite cheap on the flea market to go and pick up one of these suppressors, so it's quite decent for budget builds. It's useful to be able to look through all of these different suppressors to get a few choices, because sometimes some of them are expensive and some of them are cheap, so it really just depends, and it's good to be able to look through them all and try to decide at the time which one is the cheapest and which is the best. Moving on to the Wave. Now, this used to be best in slot, and so I think this is normally a bit more expensive, because when people don't really look into the stats fully, they just kind of remember it being good and just go and buy it. This is actually slightly worse than the one we just looked at, the SF3P plus the Monster. You get the same recoil at -17, but you lose 1 extra ergonomics at -18. Again, this is okay, but normally it's quite expensive, so usually I wouldn't go and buy this. You need Mechanic 3 for the muzzle, and then you can technically buy this at 57k for Mechanic 3 too, but on the flea market it's normally about 40-ish, but usually some of the ones slightly a bit further up, like the QDC, or the other Surefire ones, are a better bet normally. Now, the last couple are a little bit specialist. So you have the 556 Mini. This is the final Surefire one. This one is not very good on recoil at all. So when you're combining this again with the SF3P, which we'll do like we did with the other ones, if you combine those together, you get -15% recoil reduction, which is the worst one that we've seen so far. But you only get an ergonomics of -8. So this is -7 on the suppressor and -1 on the flash hider. This is significantly better than some of the other weapons. And the weapon that this suits really well is the MDR. The MDR doesn't really benefit that much from recoil because it's a bullpup, which I talk about all the time. And so you don't really care about the recoil too much, but what this means is you can suppress the weapon and only lose 8 ergo. So it's actually a perfect fit for that weapon. Normally it's a bit more expensive because it's quite useful for certain builds, because it allows you to give such good ergonomics to a weapon that's also suppressed and also fires 556, but is about 65k on Mechanic 3, but usually it's cheap on the fleet, normally about 40,000. Right, I'm only going to skim through the last couple just because these are kind of all the same and they're not really combos. So the Hybrid 46 fits to pretty much every gun in the game actually with the DT Hybrid. This mount allows it to fit to almost everything. It's very, very flexible. Now, Hybrid is needed for some later game quests and is quite expensive, but there's a great barter for it. If you just want a suppressor and you have some stuff lying around, or RAM is going cheaply, for 4 RAM you can go and buy one of these. So you can see you can get it for 36k, which is actually a lot cheaper normally than where this is on the fleet itself. So it's about 90,000 people not using this barter. So that's quite an interesting one. Then you've got the one mount versus the Gemtech 1. This is normally about 40,000. Again, you don't get great recoil out of any of these particularly. The Hybrid 46 is -9.5. The Gemtech is -9, And then this is the Rotor 556. This just goes on as is without another compensator, which is again why it's not very good compared to the others. And this is -9. So these ones I don't really recommend, but if you want to stick them on something like an MDR because the recoil doesn't matter too much and you've got some RAM that you've managed to buy at 6k off the flea, maybe it's worthwhile, something like that. But I just wanted to add them in here for completeness. Okay, moving now over onto the 7.62 suppressors. So there are less of these, but these can also fit onto some other interesting guns as well. Some of them can fit onto the 300 blackout weapons, so like the QD, the SRD QD that can fit on the MCX potentially. I'm not going to delve too much into that in particular, but the one that is really interesting is using the AK308. This was added very recently, and this means that AKs within the AKM series, so the AKM, the AKM-N, S, MSN, and also the Vepr that fires 7.62 by 39 as well, also can take this and then use a multitude of these different suppressor combinations, which is kind of interesting. So again, going down the list from best to worst in terms of recoil, what really changed up the meta this time was the QDC being added to the game. This is now the best in slot when combined with the PRS, because previously, as you can see, it was the Thunderbeast. And some of these suppressors are actually the same, it's just the muzzle device that changes slightly. But anyway, the Knight's Armament QDC was added, and this is interesting because this is on Mechanic 3, and this one here, the KAC PRS QDC, is on Peacekeeper 3, which means that you can buy the best in slot suppressor for 7.62 at level 3 traders, which is kind of cool. You'd normally expect to find that on level 4 traders, but this way they've been added slightly earlier in the progression. Now these two together, they give you -25 recoil and -24 ergonomics. -25% recoil is a big deal, is very, very good, and beats out the next best one, which is the Thunderbeast, by 3%, which is a big deal between number 1 and number 2. As you might imagine, they're quite expensive. This is one of the most expensive muzzle brakes in the game at about 18k for any of the combos. And then this on Peacekeeper 3 is about 57k, again using my value for USD, so it's probably a bit higher now, but it's basically about 75,000 for the pair, and you pretty much have to buy them from the traders because there just aren't any on the flea market normally. So as I said, the Thunderbeast is number 2. We've got the 7.62 version of the compensator and the exact same suppressor for attaching onto that. Now this basically is just 3% worse than the other one. It's got the same ergonomics at -24, but it is a bit cheaper to get hold of because the compensator is on Peacekeeper 3 at 11k, and then you could do the Scare 3 barter exactly how we described for 5.56, which makes it maybe around 40k if you can get the components at the right time. Yes, it's still 80k on the flea. You get one of these per reset doing the trade. So you might be able to get this 50k. Depends whether you think that extra 3 recoil points is worth about 30 to 40,000 to jump up to the PRS. So third best is a bit of a complicated one. It used to be really good. It's kind of gone through a few different waves of changes because it attaches onto the Mutant as well as the SR25 and a few other guns. It's had its ups and downs, but you start off with the Taper Lock. Then there are actually 3 muzzle brakes, but the best one that you can get is the 2-port brake, which gives you -8% recoil, and then you add the SRD QD on top of that, which is another 13% recoil. And so then this combination gives you -21 versus the Thunderbeast's -22, and it loses you 1 extra ergo over the Thunderbeast, so it's actually worse on both of those things, but it can be significantly cheaper. You might have guessed it, again, this is because of a barter. So the lock is only about 5,000, this muzzle brake is about 7, and then you want to get this 6-hour SRD. Now this is on Skier 4, so this is quite expensive, but this barter is really good and really, really consistent. Basically it's for a Raven statue, and not that many people can do this barter, and it's pretty much always 30k. So you go and you buy one of the Ravens, we go back to our barter itself, and you just purchase the SRD 7.62. So this is 30,000 for one of the best suppressors in the game, and it's very, very cost effective when you combine all those things together. It means that it only costs around 40,000 rubles to get this, and it's decent. Next up, the 7.62 version of the AAC suppressor. This one is straight up worse than the one above, the SRD itself, and normally it's more expensive. 50k on the flea, Peacekeeper 4, it's 75,000 rubles. I always would go with the SRD if you can. It depends on the gun, but I would always go with that if you can. There's also a new attachment, which is the SCAR for the 7.62, and this is for the SCAR H. And this one also fits on, but it's not as good as the AAC Blackout Flash Hider, so I wouldn't use it unless you absolutely have to. Okay, so next in the list, and this has kind of already been mentioned, but this is where the PRS QDC and the Knight's Armament suppressor used to sit, because you had the flash suppressor kit and the PRS on top. It was only because the QDC was added later that then it made it best in slot, because this guy had -13% recoil, whereas the old one only had -8, and so that 5 made all the difference. This is where the PRS used to sit in terms of the overall ranking and hierarchy, used to sit just underneath the AAC. Next up, we have the Daniels Wave suppressor for 7.62, which is one of the first suppressors in this caliber where we don't have a ridiculously negative ergonomics. So the best in slot so far has been -24, the worst one, the AAC, has been -27, and this one is -18. So yes, it is only -17 recoil between the two, which is the worst by far. It's 3 worse than the one we just looked at, and it's about 8 worse than the best in slot, which is really quite bad. But it gives you some more ergonomics, which maybe is an option. It's about 9k to get the compensator from mechanic, and on the fleet it's usually about 40,000. I probably would use some of the others, but if you really are desperate for getting some extra ergonomics on a build where you're getting some more recoil stats maybe from your stock or something, then maybe it's worth considering. Now this suppressor, I was actually surprised, I forgot that this existed. This is the standalone SRD without the T-lock combination. It doesn't have the recoil to justify it, so I don't really think it's ever worthwhile. I'm not sure why this is so expensive on the flea market, so I'm sure someone can tell me in the comments, but it's about 72,000 on the flea, and I think maybe there's a very specific gun that it works with or something, like the M700 or something like that, but if you don't have to use it, I really wouldn't, because it's not that great. Then I'm not going to go over it again. You can actually attach the Hybrid 46 and the Gemtech 1 both to the 7.62 weapons as well, and they have exactly the same recoil bonuses or disadvantages, which is not very good. Now, just before we go, what I wanted to touch on was about this in particular. So this is the AK mount. You can see the weapons that it attaches to, which is the AKM series. And if we go and edit the preset of one of these things, I'll show you exactly what I mean. We go and swap this over, swap this to the AK308. I might do a more complicated or more in-depth build about this at some point in the future, but using this 308, you can see that we have basically all of the options available to us. It's pretty much everything that we would ever want out of a suppressor and out of a muzzle brake on here. And then we can choose the Thunder Beast or whatever we want and reach down to very low levels of recoil. You see we already get to 83 on the AKM, which is pretty nice using this attachment. What's kind of strange though is that the 103 and those ones, the more modern versions, don't have anything like this in the game at the moment. So right now, the AKM, the older AK, the modernized AKs are beating out the 100 series, which is just kind of interesting. So overall, in conclusion, what to watch out for? Well, obviously the best in slot stuff is expensive and it's best in slot. That's fine. If you want to run something with really good recoil reduction, then go for the Seika ASR or the PRS QDC if you're running 7.62. Then things to look out for the Ultra 5 suppressor. Keep checking those boss caps and those leather caps so that you can buy these on the cheap. Same thing with the RC2, because it's fleet only and not on the traders, people kind of forget about it. It's actually a decent one for budget builds, so remember to do that one as well. And then in terms of the SRD QD, buy these once you get to Skier 4 using the Ravens, and then keep them in reserve, just so that if you do need to go through a couple of builds, then you have a few spare. And given that they're only 30,000, I think these are really good bang for buck actually. So as usual, if you learned something, please consider dropping a like and a comment. To see when I'm streaming, you can follow me on Twitter and Twitch. Come check out our ScavTalk podcast in the links below. And with all that said, I'll see you next time. And as always, have fun in your raids.